What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Jared Speaks, episode 25. Quarter of the way to 180. I want to sit with that for just a second before we get into anything else. 25 consecutive episodes of showing up and putting something real into this microphone. When I almost did not post episode 1, 180 felt like a number I'd written on paper but could not quite picture. 25 in, I can see it a little more clearly now. Thank you for being here, every single one of you. Today's episode is one I have been circling around this whole show without ever landing directly on it. And I think it's time. Let's go. I want you to think about a version of yourself that existed before anyone had the chance to tell you who you were supposed to be. Before a teacher said you were difficult. Before someone laughed at you for the way you talked or the things you were excited about. Before you learned that certain parts of you made people uncomfortable, so you tucked them away quiet and learned to show up differently depending on who was in the room. Before all of that, there was a version of you. And here's the question I've been building toward for 25 episodes without quite saying it out loud. Is that version still in there? And if it is, how far underneath everything that got layered on top of it does it actually live? I have talked on this show about being a mirror, about how my whole life I have adjusted to fit whatever room I was in. Changed my accent within months of moving somewhere new because people were mocking the one I grew up with. Read the emotional temperature of situations and reflect back whatever the room seemed to need. Became whatever version of myself seemed most likely to belong. I called that adaptable for a long time, flexible, good with people. But somewhere along the way, I started asking a harder question. If I have spent most of my life mirroring other people and adjusting to fit, at what point did I stop being able to tell the difference between the adjustment and the actual self underneath it? If you perform something long enough, if the performance becomes automatic, runs without you consciously choosing it, does it ever stop being performance and start just being you? I genuinely do not know the answer to that. I think that is kind of the point. Let me walk you through how this actually happens, because I do not think most people consciously decide to become someone different from who they started out as. It happens in moments, small ones, accumulated over years. Somebody laughs at you for something you said when you were being genuinely yourself, and something in you noticed that, files it away. That thing is not safe to show here. A parent or teacher tells you that you are too much, too loud, too sensitive, too intense, too scattered, too something. And something in you starts to try to be less of that thing, or at least to hide it from people who have power over you. You move somewhere new, or you hit a social environment where you do not fit, and you watch what the people around you do and how they talk and what makes them laugh and what makes them pull back. And you adjust consciously at first, then automatically, then so automatically that you forget you're doing it. We talked about this in the masking episode, the autism piece. The idea that some people learn from a very young age to study and perform social behavior that never comes naturally to them because they have learned that their natural way of being in the world does not land the way it should. But masking is the clinical sense, just the most concentrated version of something that happens to almost everyone to some degree. The world gives you feedback from day one about which parts of you are acceptable and which parts are not. And you are smart, adaptive, a survival oriented organism. So you respond to the feedback. You learn, you adjust, you show the acceptable parts and quietly warehouse everything else somewhere out of sight. I want to get specific here because I think the abstract version of this is easy to nod along without really feeling it. So let me tell you about something concrete. There is a side of me that is goofy, playful, loose, the kind of person who jokes around and does not take everything so seriously. If you only know me from this show, which goes pretty deep consistently, you might not expect that because that part does not come out in front of most people. It stopped coming out because at some point it came out in front of the wrong people. And the response was something along the lines of, "You're so stupid," or something that carried that same message. And something in me made a decision, not a conscious one, not something I sat down and chose, but a quiet internal adjustment. That part is not safe here. That part stays in. And I've been carrying that decision ever since. Showing the goofy side only around people I fully trust, which means most people I have ever met have only gotten a partial picture. The deep, serious, introspective version, which is real, but it is not the whole thing. And here's what I've been sitting with lately. How many other adjustments like that did I make along the way that I'm not even aware of anymore? How many things got tucked away so completely that I stopped thinking of them as tucked away things and started just thinking they were not part of me at all? Here's where this gets philosophically interesting, and I want to connect it back to things we've already covered on this show. In the ego episode, we talked about the ego being the identity the mind built around who it thinks you are. Not you, a construction, a character. And the ego protects that character fiercely. It needs to be seen a certain way. It needs to be right. It needs to be respected. It needs the story it's told you about you stay intact. But here's the thing about the ego story, it was built from the feedback the world gave you. The ego did not sit down and construct an identity from scratch based on pure self knowledge. It assembled one from everything the world reflected back, from the things that got praised, the things that got criticized, the things that made most people stay, and the things that made people leave. The ego story about who you are, in significant part, a story the world wrote for you that you have been carrying as if you wrote it yourself. And in the shadow work episode, we talked about everything that got suppressed, pushed into the shadow because it was not acceptable to show. The goofy side, the sensitive side, the side that feels things too intensely. That side needs things. All of that did not disappear when it went underground. It just stopped being visible. And from underground, it keeps finding other ways to surface. So when I ask, who were you before the world told you who to be? I'm really asking, how much of what you currently experience as your identity was actually chosen by you versus assembled from external feedback and then mistaken for a genuine reflection of who you are? I want to talk about my kids here because I think they are the clearest window into this question. Watch a very young child before the feedback system has really kicked in, and what you see is something close to an unfiltered self. They laugh at exactly what they find funny with no concern for whether it is appropriate. They express what they feel in the moment with no management layer between the feeling and the expression. They're interested in whatever genuinely interests them without editing it for what seems cool or acceptable. They are, in a very real sense, more authentically themselves than most adults ever manage to be. And then the process starts. School starts. Social hierarchies form. Other kids say things. Teachers say things. Parents say things, most of it well intentioned. And the adjustment begins slowly, then faster. The unfiltered self learns to filter. The edges get managed. The presentation gets curated. I think about this when I'm with my boys. And I think about the work I have been trying to do. Getting down on their level when they're upset. Telling them that their feelings are okay. Telling them it's safe to cry. Teaching them that big feelings do not have to be hidden. Not just because I want to be a different kind of parent than the one I had available, but because I watched what happened when that work did not get done. When the feelings got stuffed down and the adjustment happened without anyone helping the kid understand what was being lost in the process. The version of those boys that exist before the world gets to them is the real version. My job is not to protect them from all feedback. That is not possible, and honestly, would not serve them. My job is to make sure that when the feedback comes, they have enough foundation in their actual self that the feedback informs rather than replaces. I talked in episode 18 about the awakening, the turning point around 2015 or 2016, when I stopped blaming someone else for what had gone wrong and finally turned the honest question inward. What did I actually do here? Who am I actually if I stop protecting the version I have been defending? I described it as gradual, a slow turning of the flashlight from outward to inward. And I think what that process actually was, underneath the language of awakening, is this: it was the beginning of asking who I am under all the layers. Not who did I become to survive, not who did I learn to be to fit, not who does the ego need me to be so its story stays intact, but who is actually in here. What remains when you peel back the performance? What is the self that exists independent of all the feedback the world has given it? I do not have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. I think the answer keeps shifting as more layers come off and different things become visible. But the question itself, the willingness to keep asking it honestly, feels like the most important work I have ever done. I want to give you something practical here and not just philosophical. The things you loved doing as a child before you got self-conscious about them, before you learned to wonder whether they were cool, acceptable, worth doing, or productive. The things that absorbed you completely without you deciding to be absorbed. Those are data. They tell you something about who you were before the filter got installed. The things you judge most harshly in other people. We covered this in the shadow work episode. The stuff that genuinely bothers you in someone else, not just mildly annoys you, but actively irritates you, tends to reflect something unacknowledged in yourself. Not always, but enough of the time to be worth looking at. The moments where you felt most like yourself, not most successful, not most accepted, not most comfortable, most like yourself. Where was that? Who were you with? What were you doing? What was different about that situation that lets something out that usually stays in. The part of you, or the parts of you, that only come out around certain people. The goofy side that only surfaces around the one or two people who have fully earned it. The vulnerable side that only comes out when you feel completely safe. The passionate side that only shows up around someone who is genuinely interested. Those parts that come out selectively are not less real than the parts you show everyone. They might actually be more real. They are the parts that stayed closer to the original when everything else was adjusted. I want to bring this one home because I think this episode is the emotional center of everything this show has been doing from the beginning. We talked about the brain filtering reality, your perception shaped by everything the world has taught you to see. We talked about the ego, the identity the world helped build that you've been protecting as if you built it yourself. We talked about generational trauma, patterns handed down that were never originally yours. We have talked about masking, performing a version of yourself for others while the actual self sits somewhere underneath. We have talked about the shadow, everything that got buried because it was not acceptable to show. Every single one of those conversations has been about the same thing at different levels. The gap between who you actually are and who you have been performing. Between the self that exists before the world got to it and the adjusted version that learned to navigate the world's expectations. The reason consciousness matters. The reason I started this show. The reason I keep coming back to the questions of the mind and what is happening underneath the surface is this. You cannot be free inside a mind you have never examined. You cannot choose your own path while running someone else's programming. You cannot connect authentically with another person from behind a mask. No matter how perfect the mask is constructed. The whole project of this show is the same project underneath everything else. Getting closer to the actual self. Peeling back enough layers that what you are living is actually yours. Not the performance, not the adjustment, not the ego story, not the generational pattern. Yours. I do not think that process ever fully finishes. I think it just keeps going as long as you keep asking. But I think the asking itself is the whole thing. I want to hear from you on this one more than most. What is something about yourself that came out freely when you were young and got tucked away somewhere along the way? What is the part of you that only certain people get to see? And if you had to describe the version of yourself that exists before all the filtering and adjusting and performing, who is that person? Drop it in the comments. I think this is the question underneath every conversation this show has ever had. And I think more people are sitting with it than ever say it out loud. That is episode 25, everybody. Quarter of the way to 180. And somehow this one feels like the most important thing I have said in any of them. Not because the ideas are the biggest, because they are the most personal, the most underneath. Keep asking the question. It does not have to have a clean answer. That is not the point. The asking is the point. Follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. And leave a rating if you can. Share this one with somebody who you think has been hiding a real version of themselves for a while. They might need to hear it. New episode tomorrow. Stay curious, take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you then.